And now we are just about up to date with the fourth wave, the 2000s. Beginning in, I don't know when, we began to see that climate change was emerging as the foremost global environmental concern. Along with most countries, Canada ratified the Kyoto Protocol in 2002, although it later withdrew from the agreement. During the 2000s, we saw a real rise of greenwashing, a form of marketing spin in which green PR and green marketing are deceptively used to persuade the public that an organization's products, aims, and policies are environmentally friendly and therefore better. This was an appeal to nature. Now, this became effective because all of a sudden environmental concerns were at kind of on the edges of most people's minds. Maybe it was kind of a vague, nebulous concern, but it was a thing. And so companies responded by trying to make their products look more, quote, green. Now, in the case of companies, some companies actually have done a really good job of actually making their products more green. IKEA, case in point, IKEA has really overhauled its model for its business. So good job, IKEA. Other companies, not so much, although they put up a good show. A good example of greenwashing that came back to bite the company in the butt was British Petroleum. In the 2000s, British Petroleum attempted to rebrand itself as Beyond Petroleum. Now, it did this on the basis of saying that it was investing in renewable energy. Well, technically that was true, but really the investment was minimal. They kept up with their current projects, and I can't remember what portion of a percent of investment in actual renewable resources they had initially, but it came back to really bite them in the butt with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010 that saw a spring in this deepwater well into the Gulf of Mexico, and they are still cleaning up that spill to this day. During the Harper Years, federal funding for scientific institutions was cut and public access to scientific research was limited. We're still seeing the repercussions from this to this day. Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, a requirement that nearly all government projects receive a federal environmental assessment, was repealed. In 2012, the government tried to limit environmental protest by branding environmental groups as radicals or potential threats to national security. For example, a 2012 anti-terrorism strategy referred to environmental grievances as a source of, quote, domestic extremism. The Harper years were dark years for Canada's environmental movement and really for Canadians in general. I mean, we are all impacted by these legislations and the repeals of these assessment programs and these research projects. Environmentalism has failed, wrote David Suzuki in 2012. 2 years later, he launched the Blue Dot campaign with the goal of making the right to a healthy environment recognized by all levels of government and enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Under the Trudeau Liberals, Canada did sign the Paris Agreement in April 2016. This was a monumental agreement that outlined the ways in which the international community would cooperate to keep global warming to 2 degrees, or 1.5 degrees was really the aspiration, I guess you could call it, below or above pre-industrial levels. 1.5 is pretty much impossible at this point. 2 degrees is looking more unlikely as we go along. The IPCC report in 2018 said that we had 12 years left to limit climate change to manageable levels. Be thinking about this. Is this good messaging? Yes, no, why not? 0.5 degree matters. The difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees increase matters very, very, very much for issues like ocean acidity, melting ice, rising seas, drought, extreme heat events, ecosystem and human system disruption, extinctions, tipping points, and snowballing tipping points. All of these things matter. We are at roughly just below, if I remember correctly, 1 degree higher than pre-industrial levels, but we probably have most of another degree locked in, at least 0.5 of a degree locked in, which means that, it takes a while for greenhouse gases to affect the climate system. The impacts of the greenhouse gases that, say, were introduced to the climate system 7 years ago are only just now being felt. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is possible within the laws of chemistry and physics, energy policy expert Jim Skia of the Imperial College of London, one of the authors of the report, said. But doing so would require unprecedented changes indeed. So it is possible, but will we do it? 50% reduction by 2030, carbon neutral world by 2050 in order to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. Enormous changes have to be made, changes that would affect all of our lifestyles. One of the things to come out of the 21st century has been the youth movement. I'll just skim the surface of this really, but I think it's interesting to see how our youth has now been given a voice in this. In 2016, then 12-year-old Autumn Peltier attended the annual meeting of the Assembly of First Nations. Peltier is a water rights advocate and member of the Wikwemkong, I butchered that, First Nations. At the meeting, Peltier confronted Prime Minister Trudeau on his government's environmental policies. In particular, she drew attention to Trudeau's support of pipelines and the risk they pose to local waterways. So Autumn Peltier is known for her activism on issues of water. Most of you will recognize this young lady. In August 2018, Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg, I believe she just turned 18 this year, protested in front of her country's parliament every school day for 3 weeks. Thunberg's strike was against Sweden's lack of action in fighting climate change. Later that year, Thunberg spoke at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, that was COP24. Thunberg's activism inspired the Fridays for Future movement. As part of this movement, students around the world, including in Canada, leave school on Fridays to demand climate action. On September 27, 2019, Thunberg met with Justin Trudeau. This was on her tour of Canada before she made it to Edmonton. She met with him in Montreal ahead of a climate change rally. She told the Prime Minister he was not doing enough in the fight against climate change. On October 18, 2019, Greta Thunberg led a climate strike march of thousands of Albertans to the Alberta legislature. Maybe some of you were there. For a province that has a shallow history of activism, and I would say even a shallower history of fighting for environmental action, this was quite remarkable. I wrote a blog post about the backlash that came later and some of the dynamics that surround that. I'll put a link up on Blackboard to that article, and you can weigh in if you'd like. Do you think my criticisms are valid? What are your thoughts on that? So over the last, I would say, number of years, we've seen a real rise in Indigenous groups leading in this fight to environmental action and to, as well, Indigenous rights, but really linking the two together. And I think this is important. Groups like Indigenous Climate Network, the Indigenous Climate Action Group, Indigenous Environmental Network, Raven Trust, Tiny House Warriors, and many others have come forward to fight for environmental justice. There are some terms that you should know from Chapter 2 of the textbook. Climate justice is one of them. You'll hear this term often. A global movement that recognizes the intertwined relationship between global warming and social injustice. So this photograph, it's one of mine. It was taken, was it taken at the Greta Thunberg march? I think it was. It might have been a different climate march, but I think that's the one it was taken at. Sacrifice zones, this is an important concept. Communities or areas that bear a disproportionate burden for unsustainable practices. And one of the things that you'll notice is that these sacrifice zones are virtually always in areas of either lower income, marginalized communities, or very remote areas. Coincidence? I think not. Just transition, another term that you should get used to using and get used to the definition of. Just transition is a term developed by labor and justice movements to advocate the idea that the movement to renewable energy should incorporate ecological as well as social justice. So we don't want to leave people behind. Areas that have had transient industrial projects tend to leave the workers behind, and this is fundamentally not right, of course. So how can we change how we do things for the future?